This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally. Our goal is to be open, honest, and productive.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. Before we start today's show, I do want to provide this information that the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So as we begin this show, I do want to point out there's been a lot of emphasis in the media about what's going on in the detention camps with the illegal immigrants and the separation from their children. And not to say that this is not a critical issue that needs to be addressed, because it is. But at the end of the day, we still have to work through this underlying issue in this country about race and racism. And so the question that's been on my mind recently is, how much are we being manipulated to avoid this issue, to kind of keep the divide going in this country? And it seems to be more polarized now more than ever. And so it takes away people really being awake to the truth of how our economy is structured. And we're going to talk about this dual economy from the viewpoint of Peter Temin. He's an economist. But before we get started, I thought it would be interesting to listen to some information from a previous show that was provided.
Like there is a privilege for white.
And it was from a previous show that we're just going to listen to a portion of it. If you want to listen to the entire show, which was awesome, I will give you that information as we listen to this particular portion of this recording from Anne and Therese. A multicultural couple. Those that have listened to me before know that I don't like to use the word race, because it's been something created. So I don't like to say biracial. It's a multicultural couple that has been married 8 years, and they have 2 kids. And Anne is a pharmacist, and Therese is one of the hosts at WRUU that graciously was helping me fill in, as well as real estate agent, as well as a phenomenal person with knowledge about a variety of different things. So let's just take a listen to their conversation and their perspective on race and racism in this country, and how it impacts them personally in their relationship.
White people in this country, just a little bit, because it's a little bit easier to get a job if your name is Ann versus Therese. It's a little bit easier to, get out of court or not be pulled over by a police officer, or not get a speeding ticket if you're a white female versus if you're a black male. But like I've learned a lot from you too, because I've seen how hard you had to work to get where you are. So there's like, you've put in, like, you're trying to get to the top of your industry. You're very close to being at the top of your profession. You do a lot of things. You graduate at the top of your class, all these awards. You're an achiever, but you know what I'm saying? And I've just seen how hard you had to work. So it's not like you just got here because you're white. And I know that that's a fact for everybody. You know what I mean? At the same time, like, white people have to work extremely hard too to get to the top of where they want to be, you know? And I've learned that from you. Like, I've seen how hard you work. So now when I see a white person at the top, I don't think it's just because they're white. It's not just the man. It's not just that. They've clearly had to work extremely hard to get where they are, to get where you're trying to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think, no matter what race you are in our country, it's about working hard. It's also about be in the right place at the right time sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is about race. You know, there's definitely evidence out there that suggests it's about race, and race does give you an advantage. So you can't ever take that piece away. There's always that advantage there. But it doesn't mean that they didn't work hard. It just means they worked hard and they had the advantage.
Right.
I guess.
Right.
And to that point, I look at my colleagues differently, especially if they're from a different race. I think about, you know, when I'm in a group situation or when I'm, you know, working with colleagues, am I about to get a privilege because of the color of my skin,
Mm-hmm.
or am I about to get a privilege because of how hard that I worked? It gives me an appreciation. It makes me think about inclusion a lot more. How do I make sure that I don't get an advantage that I shouldn't otherwise be getting? And how do I share my privilege with other people? Because I can't not have my privilege, right? I can't give my privilege away. I can't change everybody else's perspective on race. But what I can do is make sure that I do everything in my power to make sure that when I make a decision or when I'm working in a group, that recognition is fair. And if I see that it's not fair, I call that out and I say, you know, so-and-so worked on this with me. They deserve the recognition as well. Mm-hmm. So if somebody else is working just as hard as I am, they're from a different race, you know, just making sure that when the accolades come out, that it's fairly given.
Yeah. True. I mean, and yeah, it's definitely a privilege. I mean, like, America is a country built by, like, British.
So I'm going to stop it right there because it's getting into some other parts of their conversation together. But if you want to listen to that show in its entirety, I'm going to give you some instruction on how to do that. Number one, it has been loaded to the podcast. So if you subscribe to the podcast at podbean.com, podbean.com, you'll be able to see you know, their show, listen to their show, I shouldn't say see, but listen to their show on June, that was posted for June 14th. And then if you subscribe, if you do miss a show, then you'll get notification that a show's been posted. You can also pick up the podcast through iTunes, and you would just go to iTunes, go to their podcast section and just search for One Human Nation, and the podcast will come up. So you can also subscribe there. The third way to listen to their show is going to require a couple of more clicks. You actually have to go to WRUU.org. That's the website for WRUU.org. You then have to go to Schedule and Archives. Click on Thursday and scroll down to One Human Nation. And when you click on that, the most recent shows will pop up and you'll see the June 14th show that you would need to click on in order to listen to the conversation for the entire show. So that's what you can do for any show that you miss. But if you specifically want to listen to this particular show, it's the one that's posted for June 14th. So before we get, continue unpacking, talking about are we being manipulated to keep the divide going, I think it's important to kind of revisit a different definition of racism. It's just kind of a dictionary definition that I found when I Googled, and it basically states that racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. So I think we're seeing a lot of the antagonism, or what really is hate, directed towards another race, especially people of color and specifically Black people in America, because we never really have reconciled to the impact of racism and how it's invasive in many of our systems that I've talked about before and will continue to talk about, because it's a journey and it's really being in an environment where you can learn. And I encourage you to share your stories, and you can always do that on the One Human Nation show, and I'll give you information how to connect with that at the end of the show if you already don't have that information. And the other thing that when I started thinking about this divide, I went back to exploring this speech done by Abraham Lincoln. And this was a speech that he made at the Illinois Republican Convention in 1858. And it's kind of entitled House Divided. In this speech, Lincoln noted that conflict between North and South over slavery was intensifying. He asserted that the conflict would not stop until a crisis was reached and passed. And in a biblical phrase Lincoln used, a house divided against itself cannot stand. He continued with, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. So fast forward to 2018, we are still a house divided, and I believe we're still a house divided because we never reconciled with slavery and racism, as well as what was done to the indigenous people that were even here before slavery started. And until we have that reconciliation at not only the local level, the state level, and the national level, the federal level, we will continue to have the issues that are dividing us. Excuse me. So we're going to talk about this dual economy from the perspective of Peter Temin, who's an economist that graduated from MIT. And he has an actual book out that I'm still looking forward to reading, and it's called The Vanishing Middle Class, Prejudice and Power in a Dual Economy. And so one of the things that was that caught my attention was an article that was written by Lydia Depillis, Depillis, for CNN Money. And the title of this article was, this was written December 1st, 2017. The title of the article was, 10 years after the recession began, have Americans recovered? And the recession she's referring to is the one that happened in December 2007. And what happened during that recession was, this is quoting from this article, the loss of more than 8 million jobs, half the value of the Dow and the S&P 500, and trillions of dollars in retirement accounts and household wealth. Lives and businesses were ruined and whole neighborhoods emptied out as banks took back homes bought on badly underrating credit. So then she talks about a decade later that the American economy has recovered in many ways. Employers have been adding jobs since 2010. And, you hear different reports on how the stock market is doing, and that the home prices have reached new all highs. And that was definitely true in Austin. The price of a home had increased, and I think people are shocked and in many ways struggling in that kind of market, because what they're realizing is what they're making in income is not keeping them in comfort to keep up with the cost of living and to also save money. And that's the key, is saving money. And in this article, she quotes from a person that was 58 years old from Conroe, Texas, that basically this person stated, after building up her savings in the hairdressing business, she lost nearly all of it in an investment fund managed by a financial advisor during the crash. So now she's working in a jewelry store for lower wages than she once made, and only has enough savings to live on for about a year should she lose her job. And she basically says, that she can't save money the way she used to. And so this kind of leads into this discussion that we're going to be talking about of this dual economy. And of course, this doesn't even touch base on the changes that were made in the mortgage market that had to be made in order to bail out that industry. And at the time, I was in the mortgage industry, and looking from the inside out, I can tell you it was pretty grim. It was pretty grim. And so as we get ready to listen to Peter Temin talk about this dual economy, kind of keep this in mind in how it's impacting us today.
How to look at this? I'm proposing that we take an old economics model of economic development associated with the name of W. Arthur Lewis. And he argued that developing economies often have two sectors, what he called a capitalist sector and subsistence farming. And an integral part of that model was that the capitalists wanted to keep the wages in the farming sector low. And that's because they wanted to, if they wanted to attract labor from the farming sector, they had to pay a premium over that wage, and if the farming wage was lower, they would lower their wages. And in this case, the transition typically was by going to the city. So I've adapted that model to the United States today. So the capitalist sector is what I call the FTE sector, emphasizing the role of finance, technology, and electronics in this. And that is the upper group here in this decomposition of national income. And you can say that the income that has been lost by the middle class has gone to the upper class. Okay. And so the low-wage sector is everybody else. They've had stagnant wages. The transition is by education. A college education is needed to join the FTE sector, necessary but not specific. So the implication of this model is that the FTE sector makes policy for itself. That is to say, it ignores the needs of the farming sector if it is not hostile to them. If we break down the FTE sector, the top 1%, sometimes known as plutocrats, dominates politics. They want low taxes and limited government. If you go to the 1% of the 1%, these people support individual candidates for president and other things, and have supported conservative state governors. The very rich, the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, members of the Forbes 400, have no contact with the low-wage sector, and even more extreme views than the 1% that wants low taxes and limited government.
If that's what their goal is, they have difficulty in qualifying for a mortgage loan because they're carrying so much debt. So as we continue to listen, I just wanted to plant that seed there because, at the time that Peter Temin had this talk, it was prior to the documentation that's out there now that we do need to emphasize more vocational training.
So how does that affect things? We have the investment theory of politics, known to many people here from Tom Ferguson's work, and so on. And that suggests, the bottom of this slide, whoever has the gold rules. And what that means is here in a regression from a Ferguson paper showing for state elections that the more money one side has, in this case Democrats, the more votes they get. And this correlation, this rather linear relationship has been.
So, he's referring to, at this particular point in time, was prior to the election of President Obama. And then he continues on with this part of his talk.
Has been reproduced by Tom and his co-workers for many elections in the past. And one of the things you may have found missing in the discussions of the recent election, last Tuesday's election, was the influence of the 1% of the 1% of the 1%.
So this is referring to the election of President Trump.
On the election outcome. So, if we come to the low-wage sector, you can see that it has stagnant wages. For there, as was commented in an earlier paper, that while wages grew with total productivity up to the 1970s, that was terminated then. Racial prejudice is used to sell this idea of limited government services because the argument, as was said before, you don't want to be as bad off, at least no matter how bad you are off, these other people are even worse off. And this comes out of American history. It's 300 years old, so the recommendation that we get rid of racism first before we do anything else is not a way to go about it. That's going to come at the end of things, because this is something that's happened in the last 40 years, whereas we have 300 years of this, very outlined very simply from slavery to Jim Crow laws, where that Jim Crow's laws lasted through the New Deal and the GI Bill until the Civil Rights Movement, and have now been, as the previous panel described in some detail, replaced by mass incarceration. I argue that the changing income distribution is in various ways a result of a backlash from the Civil Rights Movement. What it did was to make racial discrimination illegal, but it did not prevent coded references to it. So Nixon had the Southern strategy. Reagan announced his candidacy in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the civil rights workers were murdered. Trump's making America great again. So if we relate this to Detroit, Detroit turned black in the Great Migration. That's the massive migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South up to the North in search of jobs. And there was a critical Supreme Court decision in 1974, Milliken versus Bradley, responding to a suit by the NAACP, which wanted to unify school districts to deal with districts. And the Supreme Court ruled that boundaries were only illegal if the intent when they were drawn was to discriminate. And that doomed Detroit schools to poverty and many other northern public schools as well. So what we've ended up with now is a dual systems of education, one for the FTE sector and suburbs and private schools, one for the low-wage sector, underfunded with old buildings, and around here you think about lead in the buildings. Poor people need extra support in school, early education to help students, tutoring to help the older students, but they do not even get equal funding after Milliken. This is complemented, of course, by mass incarceration, called by Michelle Alexander the new Jim Crow. And the figure I like is 1 in 3 black males will go to prison during his lifetime. And so this is used as a method of social control. For that, the imprisonment rate is not correlated with the crime rate at all, but it destroys black communities. As we heard earlier, felons cannot vote, cannot access government programs. but the prevalence of mass incarceration affects families. So the new Jim Crow affects women and children because if black men are in jail, black women are alone, single-parent families are poor, they have to live in poor areas with poor schools. Children are discouraged by bad schools and also by the example of failed jailed fathers. Children drop out of school, go to jail, so the bad education, the dual education, is reinforced by mass incarceration. Is the low-wage sector black? No, and not enough African Americans in the population to go for this. And this gives you the little math, and it's the low-wage workers. Latinos have come on recently. They don't have a 300-year history here. They've got a 40-year history here. But they account now for as many people as blacks are, and their distribution of incomes is very much like the distribution of incomes for African Americans. Since we had a talk yesterday about Asian Americans, should know there are many fewer of them, but they have the income distribution of American whites. So the result is that we have dysfunctional politics, not just last Tuesday, but for the past several years. The rich determine public policy. They want to lower their taxes and to keep wages low. This fits the model of a dual economy. Policy is made by the higher sector, particularly in this case by what Jean Mayer, in a wonderful book on dark money, calls the coctopus secret organization of started by the Koch brothers back in the 1970s to promote these rather anarchist views. And the costs, of course, as they always are borne by the low-wage sector. And Detroit educational problems reveal this problem in spades. Okay, thank you very much.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're kind of unpacking this whole reality, really, of the world we live in the United States, this dual economy, and how much are we being manipulated to keep the divide going so we don't focus on the real issue, and realizing that for many of us, we have very busy lives. So the assumption has been, well, somebody else is taking care of this. And the reality is, as we've, all been kind of woken up, we've discovered that, the wheels are off of the train, and who's running the show here, and is it in the best interest of our communities, of our youth, and realizing the talk that Mr. Temin gave was prior to the activism that we see in our youth. And so because of the gun violence in schools, so I have hope that there is going to be this more engagement, civic engagement from the younger voters coming online that wasn't really taken into this equation. And there is a multitude of them that are already awake, which is a huge improvement over the older generations, myself included, that it took me a lot longer to wake up to the reality of racism in this country. So it's time for us to take a little break to make some announcements before we continue. So let's start with our station identification.
This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
Georgia Watch and Georgians for a Healthy Future present Managing Surprise Medical Bills and Accessing Affordable Health Care, a 75-minute workshop to learn about opportunities to access low-cost health care and manage medical bills and debt. Two times are available at 3:30 p.m. and 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, August 7th at the Bull Street Public Library in Savannah. For more information or to RSVP, call 912-661-3040 or visit chathamsafetynet.org.
And just in addition to that PSA, Chatham Safety Net is doing some additional workshops about affordable health care, because that particular public service announcement referenced that the workshop was on a date that's already passed, but they are doing ongoing workshops. And we want to let you know that WRUU 107.5 FM Summer Business Auction is right around the corner. Now's your time to donate a gift card or certificate for a product or service to be auctioned off in an online catalog next month. If your business uses gift cards or certificates, or if you can donate a gift card or certificate in any way, please let us know. Your donation will help Savannah's community radio station continue to provide unique music and talk programs that you enjoy. To donate a gift card or certificate, email fundraising@wruu.org. That's fundraising@wruu.org. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUU. So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, and we're unpacking this whole concept of, are we being manipulated to keep the divide going? So as we segue into continuing this conversation, I do want to point out in Savannah, I have been impressed by what I've seen with the Chatham County School Board, Savannah School Board, and the public schools here, and in the direction they're going to try to reach our children at a very young age, as early as 3 years old, and to provide that ongoing support for those that are older. And I think that's part of identifying, really, by the time they get to third grade, which track they're going to need to be on, whether it's a vocational track or college bound. And I think we need to plant those seeds early, because they may not be getting them in their household environment. And one of the things that I see in Savannah that's really impacting why I think we have such a high poverty rate, which is 26%, that I've seen in publications, and in some neighborhoods it's as high as 50%, and that rate has been that high for more than 30 years. So when you live in that kind of environment, decade after decade, and that's what you're growing up in, what I see with a lot of the youth in Savannah that are involved in negative activity, translation crime, is they don't have any hope. They're not participating in the abundance that others, and so they don't really care what they're doing with their lives or how it's impacting other people. And, if you've ever been in a place where you don't have hope, it's a very depressing place to be, because there is no way out in your world. It's like, well, why should I bother? Because this is the way it's always been. We have to change that narrative. We have to give our youth hope. So as we continue unpacking, how we are being manipulated to continue the divide, it also shows and demonstrates itself in our community, especially Black communities of color, in interacting with police officers. So I'm going to really, really emphasize this for Black communities, because this is what I've seen and this is what I'm aware of, and more familiar with. And I heard locally one of the neighborhood association presidents, who was African American, and he basically said it was a day they were having a community day. The police officers were there from the city of Savannah. And what this person said was very critical to changing the narrative. And he said that as parents, or as the adults, we, have historically in Black communities told our children to fear the police and not wanting the police in our communities. And that's changing in Savannah. And he specifically emphasized that adults have to give their children a different message. And law enforcement then has to be able to engage in communities so that these youth get to know them on a personal level. So there was a program that was started in Memphis that's kind of been duplicated in other cities. And I see a lot of it demonstrated in the programs that the Savannah Police Force tries to implement in the communities to really kind of break down these barriers that have been historical in our community. So let's take a listen to how Memphis made this shift in their police culture.
A decades-long decline in hospital beds for the mentally ill has contributed to many Americans with mental illnesses ending up in jails. To address that, the city of Memphis pioneered police training techniques to help people with mental illness avoid getting arrested. One thing the Memphis police are taught is that the mentally ill are actually more likely to be victims of violent crimes than perpetrators. In tonight's signature segment, the NewsHour's Megan Thompson looks at a policing approach that's become a national model.
Police officer Christopher Ross patrols a precinct on the south side of Memphis, an area with a very high rate of crime. Ross sees a lot of violence, drug use, and prostitution.
783.
But those aren't the only types of calls that Ross responds to.
Mother's involved with her son, and he's diagnosed with ADHD and mood disorder. And she said he's been taking his meds, but right now he's being unruly. So we're going to go and see what we can do to help.
Ross is part of the Memphis Police Department's Crisis Intervention Team, or CIT.
What's going on?
Officers specially trained to handle people with mental illness.
We're going to pause right there because I realize I need to kind of set this up a little bit more. One of the things we don't like to talk about in our society is the impact of mental illness. And so I do want to play just kind of a little background as far as how do we get to this point, because it does impact the homelessness that I see, that we see in our communities, and a large proportion of the homeless population has a mental issue. And then for some cultures, they may, some people are actually housing people in their, from their family that has mental issues. And it's something that is, has been a stigma, especially in the African American community. So I do want to play a portion of this information before we get back to what the Memphis Police Force did to change the dynamics of the interaction with people that have mental illness, to get a better understanding of how did we get to this point with people with mental illness in this country.
When 9.8 million Americans have severe mental illness and nearly a third of them are homeless, with large numbers every year, it becomes clear that the root of homelessness is more than a financial inability. The connection between mental health and homelessness is irrefutable, as only 4.2% of the total population in the United States suffer from mental health disorders.
Due to increasing demand for psychiatric hospital space and diminishing financial resources from the federal government, ever more mentally ill patients are being prematurely released and ending up on the streets. Homeless individuals often experience a drastic degradation to their quality of life, accompanied by personal vulnerability and social isolation, exacerbating mental health issues and often triggering new disorders.
The trend towards deinstitutionalization has permanently changed the landscape of state hospitals after 1955, when the number of mentally ill patients was at its peak. The public perception grew that community care was more humane than hospital care. Meanwhile, scientists gained confidence in finding a cure for mental illness, no longer viewing hospital treatment as a necessary course. States were and still are ill-equipped with the proper facilities during the largest shutdown of state mental health centers that is still ongoing today.
One of the major problems lies in insufficient government funding. National economic crises, including the Great Recession, has contributed to the government's largest cuts in mental health funding since the era of deinstitutionalization. States have since been transferring patients to government-funded centers, contributing to an unprecedented overpopulation in psychiatric hospitals and a drastic rise in homelessness over the last half-century. The best way to combat mental illness and homelessness is through the implementation of more hospital beds, continuing treatment after patients leave psychiatric hospitals, lowering the admission standards, and increasing funding towards state hospitals.
Okay, so I think that gives us
When 9.8 million Americans have
a little bit better setup on listening to how the Memphis police force started addressing this issue. So let's continue listening to that clip.
Here, Ross finds a teenage boy in crisis. His mom says he's being bullied at school.
See, everybody at that school knows that you're smart, that you got something going for yourself, and what they're trying to do is to stop you from being all that you can be.
Ross is trained to de-escalate situations using mostly verbal techniques to keep both officers and citizens safe and keep people with mental health issues out of jail.
Matter of fact, I'm gonna give you my number. So when you having a problem, call me, okay? If you feeling sad, you feeling depressed, call me. And you can tell me whatever you want to tell me. I don't care what it is. Handshake on that.
After 20 minutes, the teen is calm and agrees to go back inside. Memphis started its CIT program 27 years ago after the police shot and killed a man with mental illness who charged at them with a knife. The city formed a task force, including the Memphis Police Department and the National Alliance on Mental Illness. At the time, University of Memphis psychiatry professor Randy DuPont was directing the city's main psychiatric emergency service. He helped develop the CIT program.
In an event that's going to escalate and become a crisis, it's going to be those first few minutes that are pretty critical. So what they thought about when they came up with this concept was, why don't we take some of that expertise, let's identify those officers that want to do this, that could be good at it, give them the best training we can find, and then let's look and see what kind of differences that makes.
Hey, how you doing? You want to call?
That training starts with changing officers' attitudes and perceptions. DuPont says, people in crisis often act out of fear and may not understand what's happening around them. An untrained officer could interpret such behavior as defiance or non-compliance.
Officers are often trained in the academy to see non-compliance and respond with greater use of force. That's part of their training. But in CIT, what we're trying to say to the officers is, let's analyze the non-compliance. Let's look strategically at it. So we're looking for that different interpretation of behavior.
First of all, we have to talk about having compassion.
Major Vincent Beasley is in charge of the Memphis CIT program. He patrolled the streets as a CIT officer for 8 years. Are all officers cut out to do this kind of work?
I don't think so. I really think it takes a special person to do that. Not everybody's cut out for that, because you have to have patience and you have to really care about people, and you have to understand that it's not the individual himself. It's something that's going on. It's something, in his brain that's not working properly. It's a chemical imbalance.
CIT is having a measurable impact. Major Beasley says of the 14,000 911 calls last year that CIT officers responded to, only 19 encounters resulted in injuries to a person with mental illness, and the vast majority ended without a person being detained. Around 4,400 were taken to mental health treatment facilities, and just over 600 were taken to jail.
So we're not taking nearly as many people to penal facilities that are suffering from mental illnesses, because we realize they don't need to be there in most cases.
Those with mental illness who do get arrested wind up here at the Shelby County Jail, where there's a special wing with 46 cells for people with mental illness. Hundreds more inmates on psychiatric medication are housed in the jail's general population, where many are also offered psychiatric treatment and group therapy for things like addiction and anger management.
What else would you all do when he throws up this, how are you going to help me?
Joining the police department's crisis intervention team is voluntary, and officers and dispatchers must attend 40 hours of training. There are 3 days of intensive role-playing based on real situations officers have faced in the field.
John, I see that you're very upset, and I want to help you.
Nobody cares about me. And with me out of job, man, It's never me to be here for.
I want to say from the standpoint, like you said, dealing with handled by CIT.
The trainees, dressed here in plain clothes, also spend a day meeting people with mental illness.
I'm at a point now where I can go back to independent living. I still must take my medication.
They learn about what it's like to live with their conditions and about their experiences with the police.
They came to my house, sheriff department came to my house and kicked my door in.
Well, he told me to shut my freaking mouth.
Could you have a paramedic make a scene over here?
Today, there are 274 active CIT officers like Chris Ross on the Memphis force of almost 2,100, or about 1 of every 8 officers. The CIT program is operated within the department's existing budgets. Officers wear these pins to identify themselves. Ross, who's been CIT for 3 years, never answers a call without backup. When he's flagged down by a man who says he's a Vietnam veteran and has bipolar disorder, Ross pulls over to talk. He uses simple strategies, introducing himself and being calm.
I'm Officer Ross. Just call me. You okay? Well, call me Chris, okay?
Ross says a huge part of his job is simply listening and keeping tabs on people he knows might need help.
And talk to me. That's what I'm here for. Man. Don't explode. You want to know why you ain't got to explode?
Yeah, because I'm talking.
Because you're talking to me. Let me see this.
Here, he checks up on a man he's gotten to know.
Third eye, you in here?
The man lives in an abandoned motel.
You sleep? Come and holler at me. I just want to talk to you, make sure you're doing all right.
I got all seeing eyes. Man. I'm a Power Ranger and a superhero. You're really on my side.
I'm on your side.
So you understand it.
You always try to get them comfortable and let them know I'm here to help. And whatever they say, you listen to it, you repeat it to them so they'll know that you're listening to them. And eventually you'll establish a relationship and they'll feel more or less like you're there to help them versus trying to lock them up.
If Memphis police determine people might pose a danger to themselves or others, an officer can take them to the Crisis Assessment Center for evaluation and medication. Many of the services here are free. It's inside the Memphis Mental Health Institute, so if they need long-term inpatient care, patients don't have to go far. After they leave, there's also a new outpatient program for continuing psychiatric care. Officials say it's reduced the number of repeat visits to both the Crisis Center and the Institute. Mark Havener has been a patient at the Memphis Mental Health Institute. He has bipolar disorder and began having psychotic episodes 17 years ago, locking himself in a closet for hours at a time and attempting to kill himself.
Do you have any idea how many times you've tried to end your life?
Lost count at about 25.
25.
And I lost count at my hospitalizations. Again, I got tired of counting at 25.
During one psychotic episode in 2002, Havener started to strangle his wife.
I grabbed her by the throat, and I got up and I shoved her up against the inside of the front door of the house.
After he let her go, she called 911, and CIT officers responded.
By this time, I'm pretty much nonverbal. I can't express what's going on because it's a hurricane inside of me, a maelstrom. They don't even handcuff me because they see what kind of condition I'm in. Treating me as a human being in crisis and not a potential perpetrator.
Havener was hospitalized and never faced criminal charges. He got treatment, and today he is stable, has reconciled with his wife, and works as a counselor to others with mental illness. He's also become an advocate, sharing his story with the CIT trainees.
And that officer crouched down to my eye level. And he looked me in the eye. He recognized me as a person.
The strategies developed in Memphis are now called the Memphis Model and have been adopted by almost 3,000 of the nation's 18,000 law enforcement agencies. Studies have shown that CIT-trained officers are less likely to arrest people with mental illness than non-trained officers. For Chris Ross, that's one of the things he likes most about this job, the potential to help people, rather than...
Okay, so I think that gives an idea of how Memphis has handled mental health issues. And that is one of the things that I think it makes so difficult for law enforcement officers when they get that call and it's the first time they've interacted. I would encourage, as part of neighborhood mapping, whether it's through a neighborhood association, whether it's in conjunction with the police department, is to identify those houses that are housing people that have a mental illness. And that requires for that person that is housing that person with a mental illness to really be upfront about that and reach out themselves. Don't wait for a crisis to happen. And that's not to say that all people with mental illness get violent. Let me make sure that that's clear. I had someone in my family that had a mental illness, and she was not a violent person. But we have to recognize that there are people, if they have a break, if they have a breakdown moment and they become violent, and you call the police at that time, and that's the first time that this police officer has interacted with you or the person that's having the mental health crisis, it may not end very well. I think the other challenge with this particular model of policing is you have to identify police officers that have the aptitude for it. And I think that's why it's important that as part of the police training and analysis process, we really have to look at unconscious or hidden biases. And this is, very tough to do because these implicit biases are negative associations that people unknowingly hold. And we all can have biases. And they're going to be expressed automatically without conscious awareness. So we have to be aware and do our own personal assessment. And this is especially true, I think, for our law enforcement force, so that on an individual basis, without judgment, without any kind of pushback or negativity impact to their ability to be promoted because of their unconscious bias, I think the importance is to be aware and to be awake. So as we come to the end of the show, and there were some more things I wanted to share, but we're pretty much out of time, so we can get set up for the next show that's going to be coming your way. That I'll introduce here in a minute. I do want to conclude this show by stating the viewpoints expressed in the preceding program were not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. So a couple of housekeeping issues. And the first one is that if you want to share your story, because I think that's important to share our stories about our first awareness of race and how racism has impacted us. And this is whether you're a Black person, a person of color, or a white person. I think we need to hear from all sides. I think we need to be able to communicate in a safe, honest, open, and productive environment to get these stories out. And that's the platform for the One Human Nation show. So if you'd like to share your story, go to My Story. Email me at mystory@onehumannation.info. If you want information or to have a show that addresses a particular topic that you are struggling with or that you're now awake about, direct that email to onehumannation, WRUU@gmail.com. Again, that's onehumannation, WRUU@gmail.com. And remember that we do have podcasts now for the show that you can access through iTunes and by going to their podcast channel and just searching for One Human Nation, and the podcast will come up. I also have a YouTube channel under my name, Sandy Batiste, so you should be able to connect with me there also. It's either Sandy or Sandra. I'll have to double check that, but I do have a YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to the podcast at podbean.com, and that's PODB as in Baker, EAN.com. So I encourage you to sign up for the podcast so you can hear the shows at your convenience if you cannot connect with the live show. So coming up next is Troy Stoner with Sound Limits, and I hope you stay tuned for his show because Troy always has some interesting music to share with you and insights about what you are listening to. Thanks for listening, and continue on your journey through this process of race reconciliation. I realize that sometimes it gets difficult, it gets depressing, but we have to continue to push on if we want to get to that point of becoming closer to being one human nation. Thanks for listening, and have a good week.